Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being part of the webinar tonight. My name's Kathy Pedler. I'm the Director of Advocacy for the Adirondack Mountain Club. And we're just so glad you could join us for the first session of our three-part webinar series on green amendments, hosted by Environmental Advocates of New York, Adirondack Mountain Club, and Green Amendments for the Generations. If you haven't signed up for parts 2 or 3 yet, there'll be a registration link included in a follow-up email after tonight's presentation, so be sure to keep a lookout for that. And today, as we get started, we'll be providing some background on what a green amendment is and the tangible solution it provides for some of New York's most pressing environmental challenges. Before we start, we just want to encourage all of you as you're listening to the presentations to put your questions and comments in the chat box to the right of your screen. And then after we get through the presentations, then we'll address your questions. Our first presentation is from Maya Van Rossum, the founder of Green Amendments for the Generations, a grassroots nonprofit organization inspiring the nationwide movement to secure constitutional recognition and protection of environmental rights in every state and ultimately at the federal level. You may also know Maya as the Delaware Riverkeeper, leader of the watershed-based advocacy organization, the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, a position that she's had for 25 years. So now we'll turn things over to Maya.
Great. Okay, thank you so much, Kathy. I am so pleased to be here with you and with Peter Iwanowitz from Environmental Advocates of New York to talk about this really powerful solution, I think, for environmental protection. And really, long story short, and I think Kathy did a great introduction, so I want to introduce myself again. But long story short, we are really here to try to inspire you to join us on a new path for seeking and securing better environmental protection, stronger environmental protection here in the state of New York. As Kathy said, this is really a collaborative effort in New York, with all of our 4 organizations working together to advance this very important cause. Why do we say that we need a new path for environmental protection here in New York? Some of you may have heard some of these things before if you've heard me speak before, but for some of you, I think that this is new, but it's always worth reminding people that we need a new path for environmental protection because our current system of environmental laws is very literally failing us. Despite all the laws we have in New York and all the laws we have across the nation, we still have people that are drinking contaminated water infected from all kinds of sources. We still have people across the nation and across the state of New York that are breathing polluted air. We have communities that are being forced to host highly contaminated sites and families being forced to live next to them. That's nationwide, but that's also here in the state of New York. And of course, increasingly, we have communities suffering the ravages of climate change. We continue to see communities of color, indigenous communities, immigrant and low-income communities be unfairly targeted for highly degrading and polluting operations, actions, decisions, and industry. And, frankly, this targeting is not in spite of the current system of environmental protection laws we have in place. It is because of those laws, because of how those laws are written, and because of how those laws are implemented. And of course, it's not just the humans that are being impacted, but plant and animal species across the nation and across New York are being literally brought to the brink of extinction because of human actions, activities, and decisions. And that's despite all of the environmental protection laws that we have in place. And people always want to ask the same question, and they want to know the answer. Why is this happening? How is it possible that this continues to happen anywhere in the world, but particularly here in the United States of America? After all, if you go to any environmental rally, press conference, or other major action, you will hear repeatedly how we, the people, have a right to clean water and clean air and to healthy environments. And the fact of the matter is that here in the United States of America, we have all kinds of rights. We have the right to free speech and freedom of religion. We have due process rights and private property rights. We have the right to peaceably assemble and to bear arms. but we do not have a right to clean water and clean air, a stable climate, and healthy environments. Those simply are not our rights here in the United States of America. When it comes to the environment, our right to healthy environments are not protected by the Constitution, like those other inalienable human rights that we hold dear. Instead, protection of the environment is entrusted to a system and series of environmental protection laws, laws passed at the local level, the state level, and the federal level. And the truth is, fundamentally, there are all kinds of problems with these laws. There are gaps in the laws. There are rollbacks of laws. There's poor enforcement of the laws. But fundamentally, the biggest problem with our current laws here in the United States of America and in the state of New York is that primarily our laws are focused on permitting and managing pollution and degradation at the end of the decision-making process. Our current system of laws, our current system of government is not focused first on how do we prevent pollution, how do we prevent degradation from the beginning of the decision-making process. And as a result of this, leave it till later to think about it and decide when it comes to the environment, right? We are focused on managing pollution and degradation, and as a result, people and the planet are truly, truly suffering. But the passage of green amendments, which is what we're here to talk to you about tonight, and hopefully to inspire you to join us in trying to advance here in the state of New York, green amendments provide transformational change legally when it comes to protection of our environments. So first, what is a green amendment? Well, a green amendment is very simple. A green amendment is a provision that's added to the Bill of Rights section of our Constitution, and that recognizes and protects the inalienable rights of all people, including future generations, to pure water, clean air, and healthy environments. And because of the way these amendments are written, and because they are placed in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution, these rights are and this amendment are self-executing, which means as soon as the amendment is added to the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution, it has legal force and legal life, and you can enforce it against your government officials if you feel that they are infringing on your environmental rights as enumerated in the amendment. You don't need the passage of some law to help you figure it out. You know that you have a right to clean water and clean air, and if it's infringed upon, you can go to the courts if you have a green amendment. In addition, so let's just go over a few of the ways that how a green amendment changes things constitutionally and legally within the state. First and foremost, just like this, to give you a broad understanding of what a green amendment is and what a green amendment does, think about your rights to free speech. Think about your right to bear arms. Think about your private property rights. Think about how powerfully these rights are protected here in the United States of America. Think about how powerfully people rise up to defend those rights when they believe that they have been infringed upon by the actions and activities of our government. Well, that same constitutional and legal protection and power now applies to environmental rights if you have the passage of a green amendment. So it means that your environmental rights are protected in the same way all those other fundamental freedoms we hold dear. A green amendment is not a grant of new authority to the government. That's actually a sort of a misnomer that tries to be perpetuated by the industry. But actually, a green amendment, like every other provision in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution, is a restraint on government actions and activities. It is we, the people, saying to government, when you govern over us, we are telling you that you may not behave in a way that will overreach and infringe upon, either directly through government action or by you're allowing it to happen through the actions of others. You may not overreach and infringe upon our rights to clean water and clean air and a healthy environment. Constitutionally, that's a very important concept. It is a restraint, a limitation on government authority. Green amendments necessarily require government to think about environmental protection. Think about the prevention of degradation and harm at the beginning of the decision-making process. When they're thinking about what laws they're going to pass, what regulations they're going to issue, what permits they are going to grant. At the beginning of the decision-making process, they have to think, how will I ensure that my actions and activities will not result in an infringement of the constitutional right to a healthy environment? Frankly, that's what happens when government acts in a way that might infringe on speech rights or due process rights or property rights or the right to bear arms. At the very beginning of the process, because they have a constitutional obligation, they work very fervently to ensure that by the time they get to the end of the governmental process, they will not find themselves in a situation where they will have wittingly or unwittingly infringed on the constitutional right. Every government official at every level of government becomes duty bound to protect the constitutional rights of the people, and they must protect those rights for both present and future generations. Constitutional green amendments are very powerful for the environmental justice movement because all people have the same constitutional right to a healthy environment, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, income, where they live. We all have the same constitutional right. And so government is duty bound to protect all of us and all of our rights. So that becomes very powerful when it comes to environmental justice. No longer can we have environmental sacrifice zones where government determines that it will sacrifice one community in order to protect the environmental rights of another. In order to ensure that they are fulfilling their constitutional obligation, as I said, government needs to be thinking about how they're going to respect and protect environmental rights from the beginning of the decision-making process. That necessarily means they must engage in informed decision-making. They have to look at the facts about of the actions that they're about to take. They have to look at the science that has implications for the action that they're about to take. They have to look at the individual and the cumulative impacts that may result from the actions that they're about to take. If they don't engage in informed decision-making throughout the decision-making process, they won't be able to defend the outcome if there's a constitutional challenge. Ideally, green amendments result in better government decisions, advance the good and prevent the bad. But if there is a violation of the constitutional right to a healthy environment as articulated in the Green Amendment, if government officials get it wrong, then a Green Amendment gives people immediate access to the courts so they can try to vindicate their constitutional environmental rights in the courts, just like we vindicate our civil rights, our private property rights, and all of those other fundamental rights that we hold dear. Now, today, there are already 2 states, but only 2 states that have a constitutional green amendment. There are a lot of other states across the nation that talk about the environment in their constitutions, but they don't fulfill all of the ingredients of a green amendment that I've talked about so far. And of course, I just want to acknowledge there is no federal green amendment either. Now, New York is one of those states that has language about the environment in their constitution. And it's a lot of language, but fundamentally, it's not a green amendment because it does not recognize and protect environmental rights in the same way we recognize and protect those other fundamental rights we hold dear. And you're going to hear a little bit more specifically about that from Peter later today. And also in webinar series number 2, we're going to have some legal analysis that's going to dive in even more deeply into this issue, which will be powerful and important. But people do want to know how has the Green Amendment benefited Pennsylvania and Montana? They're the 2 states that have them. So is it doing anything? And yes, it is. Green amendments in Pennsylvania and Montana are proving to be very important and powerful when it comes to advocacy and litigation. Now, one of the things, this is Pennsylvania's Green Amendment. One of the things that's very notable about Pennsylvania's Green Amendment is that while it was added to the Pennsylvania Constitution in 1971, it only got legal life in December of 2013, when the Pennsylvania Supreme Court considered a legal challenge brought by the Delaware Riverkeeper Network and 7 towns against a very pro-fracking piece of legislation. A piece of legislation that gave the fracking industry, which already at that point had a solid foothold in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, gave them automatic waivers from environmental protection standards, gave them eminent domain authority in certain contexts, relieved them from the obligation of notifying those who are on private drinking water wells of potential contamination by nearby fracking, and more. This was a law that was passed in 2012. Delaware Riverkeeper Network and the 7 towns decided that we were going to challenge it on a variety of grounds, but the Delaware Riverkeeper Network decided that we were going to challenge critical provisions, claiming that they were a violation of Pennsylvania's Green Amendment, Article 1, Section 27. And the thing that's really important to know is that, as I said, fracking already had a foothold in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and it was advancing like gangbusters. But the thing is, if this Act 13, as it was called, I haven't written that anywhere, but if the Pro-Fracking Act 13 had been allowed to stand, fracking would have gotten a whole lot worse in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania because of the relaxation of all of the protections that would have otherwise been in place for the environment, communities, individuals, families, and otherwise. But this case went, and our claim of a violation of constitutional environmental rights went all the way up to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And in December of 2013, a plurality of the court found that the drilling and fracking operations that were allowed to be advancing and would have advanced had Act 13 been allowed to stand would, and this is the language of the plurality opinion, will produce a detrimental effect on the environment, on the people, their children, and future generations. And the plurality determined that the natural resources that were being harmed or would be harmed were essential to life, to health, and to liberty. And that as a result, the provisions of Act 13 that we were challenging were in fact unconstitutional because they violated the environmental rights of the people of Pennsylvania. And so all of the massive additional harm that would have been allowed to happen had Act 13 been allowed to stand were averted, were avoided, because the Pennsylvania Supreme Court declared those provisions of Act 13 to be unconstitutional. So that was the most powerful early victory, not so early, but victory of Pennsylvania's Green Amendment. And I want you to know that it was actually in the wake of that victory that I started to reflect upon the power and the importance of constitutional recognition and protection of environmental rights, and came to the realization that we in communities and states across our nation did not recognize environmental rights in our constitutions. And that's one of the reasons why we were allowed to put in place such a massive failing system of environmental protection laws. And so that's when I wrote the book, The Green Amendment, and also started to advance the Green Amendment movement. Since that 2013 victory, we have been empowering advocates in Pennsylvania, and in the state of Montana, advocates have been empowered by their Green Amendment. I'm not going to go through them for lack of time, but there are a series of cases in Pennsylvania and in Montana where permits have been voided and decisions have been rolled back based upon the Green Amendments in those 2 states. We have also been doing the work of trying to inspire other states to advance Green Amendments, right? That's what the Green Amendment movement is all about. And wonderfully, we have already inspired Green Amendment proposals in New York being first out of the gate, which was powerful and important. But also we have Green Amendment proposals advancing in New Jersey, Maryland, West Virginia, and Vermont. And as we began, our Green Amendment movement here in the state of New York is advancing as the result of a collaboration between Green Amendments for the Generations, Environmental Advocates of New York, the Adirondack Mountain Club, and the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. And I want you to know that New York's Green Amendment, Peter's going to talk a little bit more about it, but just before I close, New York's Green Amendment, if it were added to the Constitution, would recognize and protect that each person in the state shall have a right to clean air and water and a healthful environment. And this is a proposal that is moving forward right now, and that we are hoping you will join us in getting behind. And with that, I'll cede it back to Kathy to introduce Peter.
Thank you, Maya. That was really inspiring. Thank you so much for that overview. And it looks like we're getting some really good questions and comments in, so keep those questions and comments coming. We're now going to turn things over to Peter Iwanowitz to hear about the value of a green amendment from a government lens. Peter has nearly 30 years of environmental and public health advocacy experience. He has held several positions in state government, including Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation, and directed a nationwide campaign to defend the Clean Air Act for the American Lung Association. He is currently the Executive Director of Environmental Advocates of New York, a position that he has held since 2013. So now we're going to turn things over to Peter.
Thanks, Kathy, and thanks, Maya, for that amazing overview. And I also want to just take a few minutes just to thank all the staffs at our organizations at the Delaware Riverkeeper for the generations, Kathy at Adirondack Mountain Club, and of course my staff at Environmental Advocates for putting everything together and running this this wonderful webinar. And thank you, all of you who took a little bit of time out of your Monday evening to join us as well. It's a great campaign that we're involved in, and it's really fruitful to see so many people interested in the dialogue. The organization I have the pleasure to represent and be the head of is Environmental Advocates of New York. We've been around in New York State for more than 50 years, and we are an organization that's based in the state capital in Albany, and we are traditionally known for advocating directly in the state capital. We work in the hallways of power to shape laws and administrative regulations, primarily focused on New York State, but even more so focused on trying to protect the health of so many that depend upon us as we go to work every day. So we're that type of organization that runs into the burning building when it's on fire, tries to put the fire out, and assembles collaborations and coalitions across New York State to ensure lasting environmental protections, public health protections, and also to try to lift New York State to be that true national environmental leader that we always know the nation needs from New York. But I think more importantly, at this moment in our time, with what's happening in Washington, D.C. about all the rollbacks, it's a critical moment for New York State really to step into that leadership. I don't think it's hyperbole to say that the nation really, really needs New York to be that national environmental leader to shape things going forward. I'm going to spend a few minutes just to talk about how the Green Amendment came about in New York State. I think it's a really wonderful story, and I just wanted to share it with you all this evening. It's born out of the work that many of us did, especially those of us environmental advocates, in a couple of strategic campaigns. The first campaign we're involved with is the storyteller, and this one is a young woman named Michaela. She lives in the town of Hoosick Falls, and Maya had it as part of her presentation as part of the rationale. Those of you that don't know the story of Hoosick Falls, it's much like many places where one day they woke up and realized that they've been consuming drinking water that has been laced with a chemical. That chemical, PFOA, is linked to cancer. It's caused premature deaths in that community. And you can imagine if you're a mom, or any parent really, and you wake up and you understand that the water that's coming out of your tap could be making not only you sick, but your children sick. That was a campaign that we were deeply involved in at Environmental Advocates to try to get clean water for Hoosick Falls. And it is a campaign that we're still working on and trying to fight for Hoosick Falls to get clean water and to have some long-term surety that what's coming out of their tap is not going to make them sick, or worse, kill them. And I included a screenshot here of a video. I didn't want to try my luck of running a video during a webinar. But if you go to our website and look for news releases in late 2016, you'll see this wonderful video from Michaela, as well as in early 2017, other videos from the storytellers that helped launch our Green Amendment campaign in New York. The other campaign that we were deeply involved in 2014 and 15 was the issue of oil trains that were flowing through Albany. I don't know if you know this, but at one point in time, Big Oil wanted to create the third largest crude oil hub in the nation in the little sleepy port town of Albany, New York. What they wanted to do, and what they were doing, but they wanted to expand even more of, is bringing fracked oil by train, shipping it from train cars onto barges and ships, and floating it out to overseas markets. But they also wanted to bring in dangerous tar sands crude oil. So we worked heavily with the community, particularly the community in the south end of Albany where this port is located, to one, stop the dangerous proposal of bringing Canadian tar sands oil through our town and into onto the Hudson River, but also to put an end to those bomb trains that were flowing from the Adirondacks, from the western part of New York State, in through Albany, and creating such an environmental and public health hazard that we really wanted to help the community. And it's a traditional environmental justice community. This is a picture of Lawrence. When we shot this video with Lawrence in his playground, you can see he's about 20 feet away from an oil train. Basically, a chain link fence is the only protection that Lawrence and the rest of the community in this public housing project had from these oil trains and all the fumes and all the dangers that were in their community. And when we started to work with Lawrence and his friends and family and all the people who were living at Ezra Prentice Homes, which is the public housing development there in the south end of Albany, it was not only the bomb trains that they were worried about, but they were also deeply impacted by a heavy influx of all the industrial emissions associated with the port. There's a lot of train activity, huge amount of truck traffic in and out of the port. It's the classic environmental justice community of the absolute wrong place to put public housing for low income and people of color to be living in. So the campaign that we were sort of working on in Hoosick Falls to provide clean water for the town to drink, and for a healthy living environment for the south end of Albany, the families came to us and said, don't we have that right? As Maya talked about, don't we have that right to breathe clean air that won't make us sick? Don't we have that right to drink water coming out of our tap that won't kill us? And we said, well, as humans and morally, yes, you certainly do have that right. But from a legal standpoint, you don't. We went to the state constitution and showed them the New York State Bill of Rights, and we pointed out interesting language about all the things that Maya talked about. Also buried in the New York State's Bill of Rights is a provision on gambling. Now, listen, I don't have anything against games of chance. I personally don't partake in them all that much, nor do I have anything against people who host games of chance like bingo. But we thought, well, you know, for the sake of the people in Hoosick Falls, for the sake of the people in the south end of Albany, if we're going to have in our Bill of Rights the right to host and play games of chance like bingo, we better change our Bill of Rights to inject into that right for clean water, clean air, and a healthful environment. We also looked at other provisions of the Constitution just to make sure there was nothing in there. And as Maya mentioned, we do have Article 14, which is the conservation article. We're going to talk about that in future webinars, but it does provide some rights about healthful environments and what needs to be done. But they are tied, and legally through court cases, are tied just to the protection of the forest preserve. They don't extend beyond that, and they aren't a self-executing right. So clearly we were onto something. We wanted to change it. So we drafted up bill text and presented it to the legislature in 2017. And we thought, let's try to keep it very, very simple. And the legislature came up with us, in collaboration with us, this simple phrase: environmental rights. Each person should have a right to clean air and water and a healthful environment. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple. That is the literally actual text of the bill that we have before us in New York State. We launched our campaign, as I said, in 2016, and we actually got first passage of the environmental rights in the legislature by the New York State Assembly that year. And when we launched the campaign, Maya was great to join us. We had other advocates who were with us in the room, like Kathy's former head, Neil Woodworth, longtime leader of the Adirondack Mountain Club, members from the League of Women Voters, as well as legislators, coming to the kickoff press event in Albany. And as you can see, that right to play bingo but not clean water in New York State's Constitution resonated with the writers of the New York Times. And this is how our campaign sort of began to unfold. We unfortunately did not get the second house to go along with the Assembly, and we did not get both the Senate and the Assembly concurring on this environmental right in our first year. But our campaign was born, and we built a lot of power, and we built a lot of momentum in that first year and brought it back in 2018. Once again, we got the bill passed by the New York State Assembly, but the leadership of the state Senate just didn't seem at the time very interested in passing strong environmental standards about anything, let alone injecting this right to clean air, clean water, and a healthful environment. But we really felt that it was necessary. So we continued to build power and build strength and build a campaign over the years. What was really wonderful for our campaign in New York was that the voters decided, amongst a host of other changes that they wanted to see in Albany, they also wanted to see leaders in Albany that would actually be for the people, not the polluters. So the voters flipped Albany so that we would have leadership that was more sensitive to a range of different progressive interests, including a healthy environment and strong rights for all. So the fall elections ushered in new leadership into the state Senate and returned the strong leadership of the state assembly. So last year, when we convened in Albany, we put environmental rights at the very top of our legislative agenda. We had 3 pieces of legislation that we fought for at Environmental Advocates, one of which was the Environmental Bill of Rights. We wanted to ensure that this new ethos coming in, this new leadership in Albany, would understand what we've been hearing so much from the groups on the ground in the communities, that we wanted a right to clean water, clean air, and a healthful environment. And we challenged the new Senate leadership to bring this forward for a vote. And you know what they did? As part of their Earth Day package, just a year ago, last Thursday night, on April 30th, the state legislature came together on bills that have been pent up for a number of years, with the Assembly passing them year in, year out, and the Senate leadership, the old leadership, I should say, refusing to bring them up for the vote. But the new Senate leadership brought this bill up for a vote, and we got first passage in both houses. So the legislation that we have in New York enjoys that first passage, and we are now building our campaign with all of you so that when elected officials are out in New York looking for your vote next fall, you can pose the question to them: are you going to vote for the amendment to give my right to clean water and clean air in the New York State's Constitution? You know, if I return to you to office, will you promise to vote for it next spring when it comes up for second passage? Or for those new legislators, and we're going to have a lot of them. There's a lot of open seats in New York State, and especially in the Senate. They're going to be asking for votes in New York, and it's up to you to press them and ask them, well, okay, you don't have much of a track record. You certainly don't have a record in the state legislature, but are you going to vote for my right to clean air, clean water? So we have that opportunity coming up this fall, when all members of the state legislature are up and running for office, to pose that question to them as they're out and about and courting your vote. It's a powerful moment. I will just say this before I sort of wrap up my presentation here. We have amazing storytellers that have really come forward. Remember the image of those young kids from Hoosick Falls and the south end of Albany. They deserve clean air. They deserve clean water. We also think in New York State, obviously with the Trump administration rolling things back in Washington and ensuring that the polluters are placed before the public in their eyes, it's another value set that New Yorkers must rise up and say, this is not who we are. It's a key moment in time. It's almost like a gut check for New Yorkers. Are we going to stand up for the people of Hoosick Falls and all the communities like them? Are we going to stand up for Lawrence and his family and friends who live in public housing in an EJ community, a chain link fence away from bomb trains, diesel exhaust, and a whole host of hazards that are triggering disease in their communities and cutting short lives? Or are we going to stand up to create that environment where New York State actually is that green leader that this nation truly needs from it? That opportunity is ours. We need to get second passage of our Environmental Bill of Rights next year. And if we do so, the bill immediately goes onto the ballot for the fall elections. So if we can get second passage, constitutionally, that bill needs to appear before the voters in the fall of 2021. It's a wonderful time to be working on this campaign. It's a wonderful time to be working with such great partners that we share with the Adirondack Mountain Club, Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and For the Generations campaign to be advancing this thing. And it's a real pleasure for me to be with you tonight. I always love to just provide my contact details to you all. And I'll let this linger for a moment so you can jot it down or snap a picture of it. We're here, always available for questions, always available to engage in dialogue. You have my email on that, and don't tell many people who aren't part of the webinar, but that's my mobile phone. I want to make sure that if you have questions, you have concerns, you want to know how to get engaged, or if you want to know where your legislator has been in the past on these issues, and did they vote for the Green Amendment last year when it was before them, give us a call, send me an email. We'll get you the information that you need. And here's a little bit more details about how you can get more deeply involved. First off, obviously take action. You have the opportunity to sign a petition and pledge your support to be fighting alongside of all of us to support the Green Amendment. The web link is up there. We're also hosting a couple of other webinar sessions for you to log in with more legal details and a broader perspective on the Green Amendment. You can register for all of the webinar series that we're hosting here with our partners, both session 1 and session 2. So more opportunities to learn more about the Green Amendment, more opportunities to invite your family and friends to be part of the dialogue the next time around. I just want to underscore one more point before I end my presentation and take questions from you all. A big piece of what Maya talked about is front-end decision-making. And I can tell you from a personal basis, having worked inside government and was the head of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, I can tell you that if a Green Amendment existed when I was commissioner, I know it would be part of the briefings that the Office of General Counsel would give me when I was forced with making a decision. They would brief me on all aspects of the law, the regulations, and what we needed to do and make a recommendation. And when I think back on it, I've thought, wow, wouldn't it be wonderful if part of that briefing was that we have an amendment, an agreed portion of our Bill of Rights that basically said that I had to make a decision one way or the other based on whether it would be a violation of somebody's civil right in New York. That would lead to much better front-end decision-making about where we site facilities in proximity to public housing. We would make much better determinations based on environmental justice principles in New York. And we would make better determinations of whether or not we should have drinking water supplies next to a chemical manufacturing plant that we're using PFOA. Those front-end decisions are what the Green Amendment is all about. It's our values, but it's also encouraging government to make better decisions at the beginning of the process rather than trying to fix it at the end. So I'll turn it back to you, Kathy, and look forward to the dialogue now.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. That was really inspiring and really exciting to see what's happening here in New York and being part of that. I know Adirondack Mountain Club is extremely excited to be working with our partners on this. And so, yeah, everyone make sure that you check out the next session. You'll be getting that email again with that same link for the petition and for the next 2 sessions. So make sure you keep an eye out for that. So now we'll move to questions, and it looks like we have a few of them. I think this first one, I'll pitch this to you, Maya, and then we'll move to Peter. So this one is from Tony. I need a succinct description of the Green Amendment that I can send to my village board and the Cayuga Lake Watershed Intermunicipal Organization.
So great question, Tony. We will be following up with some materials in response to the webinar. So mainly want to highlight that for you. That will include some
we may be having some connectivity issues with Maya.
Can you not? Am I moving?
Yeah, I see you. You're good.
Okay. Just making sure. Anyway, so we'll be following up, Tony, with some information. I did put in the chat box a link to one single sheet, double-sided, that can help you. But we will give you some follow-up materials. But basically, it is an amendment that's added to the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution that recognizes and protects the rights to clean water, clean air, and healthy environments in the same way we recognize and protect those other fundamental human, civil, and political rights. So that's your one-liner, but we will be sharing with you follow-up information in response to the webinar, as well as some links to each of our 3 organizations and some additional materials. So you'll be able to find something to suit your needs.
Great, thank you. Okay, here's one for you, Peter. This is from Lisa. Is it at all similar to a Bill of Rights in Rights of Nature movement that provides also rights for the ecosystem or water body itself?
So yeah, I mean, Maya can probably pick up on my answer here a little bit, but yeah, what we're trying to do is to ensure that when we're looking at either a separate body of water or looking at sort of a permit decisions before government, whether it's a body of water or clean air, with the constitutional right that is now before the legislature, it's the right to clean air, clean water, and a healthful environment. So it's about healthful environments for ecosystems, for fish and other wildlife, but it's also about healthful environments for people. So it really would provide a civil right that then can be enforced by an individual against a poor government decision. I probably should just reflect a little bit. Part of my time in government was as acting commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation. And I know from the briefings that I would get from legal counsel and others, they would run through all the different legal aspects of making a decision one way or the other, and we'd kind of vet things. And as we started to look at environmental rights, I often reflected back on those sessions I would have with the general counsel at DEC. And I wonder if she would, how the meetings would go if she presented to me this case of a permit, say, and said, listen, because we have this environmental right now, you need to make this decision this way. If not, you'll bring the possibility of a legal challenge against an action of violating somebody's civil right. And I thought that would just such be a powerful discussion to have as policymakers would determine, do I issue a permit to allow a water discharge or an air discharge, or to locate water intake, pipes next to a chemical plant that's working with PFOA, or to put a public housing projects next to a port where we have a lot of industrial activity. So part of what environmental rights will do is also lead to better front-end decision-making to protect nature and people.
And just to add a little bit more, Lisa, often, generally when people are talking about the rights of nature, they are talking about giving nature's rights so that you don't have to have the human component of demonstrated harm before you can get access to the courtroom. You just have to show that a river or a stream is harmed and have some great lawyer that's going to go into the courtroom and advocate the case. Essentially, it's making the standing requirement that is necessary to gain access to the courts simpler, because you're sort of cutting out the middleman literally being a person who has to show harm from the environmental degradation. When we're talking about a Green Amendment, we are not giving rights to nature, right? A constitution, particularly the Bill of Rights, is fundamentally about people and the relationship between people and their government, and people telling government, we are giving you permission to govern over us, but here are the things that we are holding unto ourselves. And again, you may not, as you govern, overreach and infringe on these fundamental human, civil, and political rights that we are holding unto ourselves. So you do still have to have that harmed person when you have a Green Amendment in order to enforce the constitutional right. But I do want to just say two things. I think as Peter suggested, I don't think that there's any single environmental harm where you are not going to be able to show that some person, some community is being harmed in a significant way. And that you won't be able to find that impacted representative to help champion the rights of nature in the courtroom in seeking to enforce the Green Amendment. That's number one. And number two, look, I want to say right up front, I truly, personally, very much believe in the rights of nature. I have a very deeply held belief about nature as being living, all elements of nature being living entities, deserving of their own freestanding rights. But the reality is, not everybody joins me in that belief system. And so strategically, if you were to add a rights of nature element to a Green Amendment, you are going to make it harder to pass. Now, I have written rights of nature language for other states where they're considering adding that concept. Welcome. But I'm pretty clear with people, you really are making it much more difficult to achieve passage if you add that concept, number one. And number two, I don't think that you need to add it in order to be able to fully vindicate the protection of nature with a green amendment that's based on the human impact, as Peter talked about.
Great, thank you. Maya, since you're there, I'm going to give you this one. This is from Carolyn. What is the intended meaning of clean, pure, stable, and healthy? This seems very important.
You are absolutely right. It is very important. And as with every Bill of Rights provision, there is language that requires definition, right? The right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. What's unreasonable, right? The rights to free speech. Well, what is free speech, right? Every Bill of Rights provision is broadly written so that you can capture an array of concepts and so that the provision can evolve. The language, the decision making or the definition of each of these elements has to be determined in a couple of ways. In the first instance, your government officials, elected officials, regulatory officials, town councils take their first pass by passing legislation, by passing regulations to try to give life to the environmental rights provision. But in the final analysis, people can go to the courts and have the courts be the final arbiter about whether or not they got it right, whether or not they got the definition of what is clean water correct in one context or another. And courts are well positioned to do that kind of legal analysis. After all, like I said, they do it in the context of every other Bill of Rights provision. Now they just have to take those same standards of legal and constitutional interpretation and apply them to environmental rights the same way they would apply them to other rights.
Great, thank you. Peter, here's one for you from Lisa. She's asking if you're also involved in the CLCPA Action Committee and if you're considering bringing the amendment issues into those meetings and public hearings, etc.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. So yes, I was appointed to the state's Climate Action Council, which flows out of our new climate law. And that council is going to be charged with developing an action plan to reduce New York State's emissions, essentially move the whole state off of fossil fuels over time. I don't know if there's an opportunity to talk about environmental rights within that Climate Action Council process. Quite frankly, I think we're building a huge campaign of people around this movement and taking on polluters, and I think we're probably best to just sort of advance this just as we've been doing outside of any governmental process and just have the people of New York State telling the state legislature that they want to get second passage of this bill. Let me just dwell on that for a moment. New York State's constitution says that the people can amend its constitution through the legislative process by a vote of the legislature. So we brought the Green Amendment to the state legislature in 2017, and we'll continue to bring it back. We need to get two legislative bodies with an intervening election. So we have to have a new legislature installed. And then once we do that, we can bring it up a second time. So the first vote happened last year. We're in the second year of a 2-year legislative session. After these elections, we'll have a brand new legislature that will bring up the Green Amendment and hopefully vote for it. After they do that, the Constitution says you've got 2 successive legislatures voting yes, and then it goes directly to the ballot. The governor has no say in this measure. This is through our elected representatives in the legislative process. New Yorkers saying we want to change our constitution and add this environmental right. So that's why we get 2 legislative sessions to do it. So just to recap, I don't think it fits within the climate action process. It certainly will help our fight against climate change, but we just should mobilize on the outside of that whole governmental process that's working on climate rules and get elected representatives who are going to give a second passage next spring.
Thank you very much. I think that answers another question that was posted by Natalie, but I'll let you take this one, Peter, by Charles. How does this proposed amendment differ from the seeker process? How will it work better?
Yeah, I'm going to rely on Maya to back me up from a legal perspective, and I know we'll get on these into the future webinars too. A shameless plug that you should all dial in for the next couple of webinars, because we're really going to get into the technical details and legal aspects of it. But the State Environmental Quality Review Act is a process that requires, in certain instances when you get big projects and big proposals, an overall environmental review that it takes into a lot of different factors. And those reviews will still need to go forward as we take a look at projects in New York State. And they'll have to start screening them for a range of different things because of our new climate law. What the environmental right is that as we're going through the seeker process and before a determination is made one way or the other, that New York decision makers will also have to balance the right to clean water and clean air as they're making decisions about issuing permits under seeker, or even permits and other types of decisions that they would make. Will now have to be weighed against this right to clean water, clean air that will then be in our Constitution. So it's a part of the decision-making process that will go in concert with seeker, but I think it will give a lot more value to nature and a lot more value to individual rights for clean water and clean air than has ever been afforded to New Yorkers.
So I think Peter said it perfectly. So the only two things I will add is, in a court case in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, one of the things that a Pennsylvania judge said, this was after our Act 13 case, said one of the things that the Pennsylvania Green Amendment does is it puts a thumb on the scale for the environment. And that's really what Peter just said. When you're engaging in the seeker process, it will give added strength to the necessity to select the decision that best protects the environment and will honor the constitutional rights to clean water and air and a healthful environment. So that's number one. Number two, seeker, as good a law as it is, you get a bad legislature in, guess what? You can roll with that, right? You get bad government. That happens all the time. As Peter said it right at the top of the hour. That's what we're experiencing now at the federal level. A constitutional amendment, it's hard to add to the Constitution, but that means it's also hard to remove. So once we get it in there, we'll really be able to count on it on the long term. And then the third thing is that is in fact one of the questions we are actually going to delve into in webinar number 2. So I really encourage you to join into that conversation to learn even more. But I think you got the basics there on how a New York Green Amendment will really up the ante under seeker as well.
Thanks, Maya. Here's just a follow-up for you, Peter, from Lisa. Could you clarify, is the entire legislature up for re-election, all senators and all assembly reps?
So yes, in New York State, they're up every 2 years. So every senator and every assembly member is running for office this fall. There'll be some primaries that will sort out some races in June, but every member of the New York State legislature is up. I just want to add, those of you who are participating in the webinar right now, it's a great slide of our news conference, but I just wanted to note we've got to update our slide deck. That was the original bill text. If you're looking for the bills now that are currently live, the Assembly print is 2064 and the Senate print is 2072. Same sponsors, Engelbright and Carlucci, but a little bit different bill numbers after our first couple of years going forward. But we've got great sponsors and wonderful votes. They both passed with bipartisan support and overwhelming in both houses.
Great. Yes. Looking forward to that happening in 2021 too. So here's a comment from Tony. The natural world and humanity are connected, and we need to restore that balance to protect future generations of all life. Economics is a subset of ecology. Hence, clean water and air first, then follows industry development of energy and food systems.
Beautiful comment. Thank you.
Yeah.
The other thing I do want to say, when you're doing a constitutional analysis, when it comes to the environment, economics doesn't get to be used to trump the constitutional right to clean water and clean air. Ooh, that's quite a play on words there. But when you're doing a constitutional analysis, industry or government is not going to be able to come in and say, well, we're going to be able to create X number of jobs or secure X amount of economic value for the state, and therefore our corporate goal can override, supersede somebody's constitutional right to clean water or clean air. Government can't take that industry's economic goals and accomplishments and use it to override your constitutional right to clean water, clean air, and a healthful environment. So it's very, very powerful in that way too, in terms of the analysis, what you can look at and what you can't look at.
Great, thank you. So I think we're pretty much through our questions. There is a question from Lisa about a flyer to hand out to people, and I believe there'll be a link to that in our follow-up email, as well as other resources, and again, the sessions that we've been talking about, and the petition. So you'll want to keep an eye out for that email. It looks like there's one more question possibly coming in. We'll just take a second and see if Ira has a question.
How fast Ira can type.
Yeah.
Take your time.
And somebody did ask a question about New Jersey, and just want to confirm that you did mean New Jersey. If you did mean NJ versus NY, I gave you a link. If you meant NY, you'll be getting links as part of the follow-up email from our collaborative.
Okay. No, I think that's it. I think that's all of our questions. But this has been a really informative webinar, really great overview. Peter and Maya, thank you so much. Oh, wait, here's one more question. Sorry. We still have a couple minutes. Would this amendment allow New York to sue other states who pollute our state? And then he apologizes for not being a fast typer. So yeah, let's see. Maya, could you take that?
Yeah, so, this is the Bill of Rights provision is about the relationship between the people of New York and their government. The state of New York can't go in and try to enforce Pennsylvania's Green Amendment to the benefit of the New York citizenry, vice versa.
Can a Pennsylvania resident help with this initiative? I live right over the border, but work and vacation in New York.
Yes, absolutely you can. I mean, if you're working and vacationing right over the border, tell the people that are living in New York that they should be in touch with their elected representatives, and that they should be not only committing to do this when they're running for office in the fall, but also committing to vote for the Green Amendment when it comes back up in 2021. This is a great time to be engaging people and educating people about the value of it, and talk about the lessons you've learned today from Maya about how Pennsylvania is putting their Green Amendment into work and the benefits that are now accruing to people who live in Pennsylvania because of the Green Amendment being existent and the hard work of the Delaware Riverkeeper in that litigative case. I'll just add a quick personal note. I'm always just fascinated and personally tickled when I see Maya's case presented, because it's actually the 15th birthday of my daughter, December 19th. So maybe I was like psychically sort of attached to this sort of thing, because that's when the case was decided in Pennsylvania that I was going to fight for this well before I knew I was going to fight for agreement in New York.
Okay, thank you. So it looks like we have a comment from Erin Tromley, and I think she was responding to some of the situations you were describing, Peter, and she said these are more ways we are asked to pit human health against economic growth. I think New York's government should be open to this conversation right now.
Well, I totally agree. And the wonderful thing is New York's government is open to the conversation. As I mentioned, we have leadership in Albany that brought this Green Amendment to the floor, gave it first passage. They understand the public backing for the Green Amendment. It is a bipartisan level of support. It is a broad level of support that the Green Amendment has enjoyed. So I think more and more we're going to see sort of the better understanding of how healthy people in a healthy environment really does drive where we need to go economically. And I think we're going to see that even more so, the public wanting to have that because of what we're going through right now with the COVID crisis. People understand the value of clean water. We need it, right? That's the first line of defense. Wash your hands. You need to be doing that clean water. Open spaces have provided a great respite for a lot of individuals during the COVID crisis. So the greater sensitivity of protecting our environment and understanding this as a value set will also drive better front-end economic decisions.
Right. Thank you. So this one is for Maya from Chris. Why do you consider the environmental human rights in the constitutions of Hawaii and Massachusetts, for example, as distinctly different from those of Montana and Pennsylvania? Besides wording and the like, is it simply because the former two are not in the Bill of Rights sections? Why does this matter for respecting, protecting, and fulfilling environmental human rights?
So great question, and it's really a combination of things, and it's a little bit different for Hawaii than for Massachusetts. Actually, Hawaii has while Hawaii's language is not in the Bill of Rights section of the state constitution, Hawaii talks about the state as being a trustee of the natural resources and has some pretty powerful language. And through interpretation, there has been, from the courts in Hawaii, there has been some really powerful legal interpretation about the duties of government officials to protect the environment for the benefit of the people. But there is a difference in implementation. While you have that trust obligation and implementation, you don't have the individual rights component in the Hawaii Constitution. So that changes up a little bit what cases you can approach and how you can approach them in the claims that you can make. Massachusetts, similarly, is not in the Bill of Rights section. And for both of them, see, putting it in the Bill of Rights section of your Constitution, what you were doing is a couple of things. For the most part, you're in terms of states, you're by that placement making the language self-executing, right? Which means you don't have to have a law that implements it in order to make a constitutional claim if you think that your right to clean water has been infringed upon. The other element of being placed in the Bill of Rights section is what you are saying very clearly to government is that this is not a grant of authority to government officials. This is a restraint on authority. And frankly, that's a very conservative concept, which is one of the reasons why it's so powerful. And that really ensures that government decision-making does have to be mindful of the environmental ramifications of what they're doing from the beginning of the process all the way to the end, because otherwise they will not be able to say that they will not be able to defend against a challenge that says, well, you didn't consider the impacts or you didn't consider the science, if they in fact can't demonstrate that they engage that kind of decision making. It also changes the lay of the land. I think I alluded to this, that if the government is going to infringe, there are some really clear standards that have to be met. You have to show that there's a compelling state interest and that you've done your best to limit the infringement. In the state of Massachusetts, as is the case with a vast majority of the states that do have language, well, some of the language, they talk about the people shall have the right to clean air and water, and other language that in some pretty significant ways parallels Pennsylvania, but the failure to place it in the Bill of Rights section changes the application and the interpretation legally and constitutionally. But also there's some very clear language that in the Massachusetts provisions that says the way you get these rights is that we are giving the legislature the power to enact legislation necessary to protect such rights. So the way you get the rights is that your government officials in Massachusetts pass environmental protection laws. If they pass sucky laws, your constitutional right has been vindicated. They've fulfilled their constitutional duty, but you're not really any better off environmentally, and you don't have a legal challenge to be able to say, well, my right to clean water was infringed upon, because when you go to the courts, what the courts will say is, no, your right is that the legislature would pass legislation. Now, whether you agree with that legislation or not is a different matter. And if you disagree with that legislation, your solution is at the ballot box. Vote them out of office. So that's a really significant difference. And that's in so many of the states. What we see is very interesting, sometimes very powerful language, but it begins or ends with either, and this is a statement of policy, or it begins and ends with, and the way you get these rights is your state passes legislation. So the actual constitutional right is the passage of the legislation, not necessarily the outcome of an inalienable right to clean water.
Excellent. Thank you, Maya. Before we go on with questions, I just want to, because we didn't point this out, I didn't point this out before, there's a slide on the screen. Everyone, please take note of that. There's a link to a petition that you can sign, and then make sure you share with friends and family to support the Green Amendment. And then there are also links to the next set of the next webinar in our series, part 2, next week, and there's links to signups for that as well. So I just wanted to point that out before we continue with questions. Chris had a couple more questions, and we have a little bit more time. So the next question we'll give to Peter. For a state like Pennsylvania, which has a constitutional environmental human rights provision that borders New York, which currently does not, do you see this impacting the location decisions of businesses?
So maybe the question is, do you think, because of the unequal treatment between, kind of where things are in Pennsylvania versus New York, that businesses might flee to one state or the other? Haven't seen that. I haven't seen an influx of businesses in Pennsylvania coming to New York because we don't have a Green Amendment here. I think really this is about a value set, and it's great to have the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania having a strong value set in their Constitution. And we're kind of a little bit jealous, to be honest with you. And I think it's time for New York to sort of step up and sort of try to reclaim the mantle of environmental leader when we have all of these other great states in the Northeast moving ahead, implementing not only longstanding provisions about this value set, but putting them into practice. We're seeing decisions in Pennsylvania flowing as a result of the wonderful court decision from 2013. There's always that tension, I think, and always that threat. When I was in government, we were trying to do the regional greenhouse gas initiative that New York is a part of. Industry came to me and said, if you do this, certain things are going to happen, and we're going to close down our power plants in New York and move them to Pennsylvania and build them there. Well, that was obviously ridiculous, but those things do happen from time to time of people threatening to move out of state. But this is the moment in time where I think people really cherish this value of clean air, clean water, really acutely at this moment in time where we're seeing the benefits of clean air and the downsides of dirty air. Quite frankly, there are a lot of people who are struggling, battling the COVID infection because of decades of having to breathe in dirty air. So this is that moment to really have that discussion in New York about changing our value set and putting one into place where we would have that right to clean air, clean water, and a healthful environment.
Great, thank you, Peter. One more question from Chris, and since we still have time, I'll give this to Maya. In addition to green amendments, do you envision a regulator attempting to use eminent domain or inverse condemnation as tools to protect the environment or environmental rights where these ends are interpreted as a public use or purpose?
I don't. And, just like I noted that placement of the Green Amendment in the Constitution means that when somebody tries to use their private property rights in a way that would infringe on the environment, if you have a Green Amendment added to the Constitution and somebody tries to use the Green Amendment in a way that will infringe on other fundamental freedoms like private property rights, their property rights recognition is in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution on par with environmental rights. And so that actually becomes the check on government overreach that would infringe on private property rights. Nothing's absolute, right? There are appropriate times, way, places, and spaces when government can use the power of eminent domain, but there are guidelines for that. And one of them is that, you have to take into consideration the constitutional property rights of the people. If you're trying to do something for benefit of the environment based on a Green Amendment or not based on a Green Amendment, that constitutional right, to private property interests still exists and would be utilized to make sure that there was not an overreach in the other direction.
Great, thank you. Here's another question from Donald Thomas. What level of scrutiny is most likely to be used by the Court of Appeals? Rational basis, intermediate, or strict scrutiny? Is that one I can give to you, Maya?
Yep.
Okay.
So because we're talking about a Bill of Rights provision, we really are talking, unless something strange happens. But we really would anticipate strict scrutiny would be the appropriate level of review. And that's why I also said that in order to successfully infringe upon the constitutional rights to clean water, clean air, and a healthful environment, government would have to be able to show that there was a compelling state interest that supported that infringement, and that they did what they could to minimize the infringement on the constitutional right. And that's part of the strict scrutiny standard of constitutional review and interpretation.
Oh, great, thank you. Peter, here's one from Denise. So we are hoping to affect the laws in the states because the federal government seems to be dismantling every single federal environmental policy.
So yeah, part of it is to ensure that we have a strong value set about how we view a healthful environment in New York, and clean water and clean air. Obviously, we want to have that value set on our books and have better decision making happening in New York because of that value set. And I think our campaign was born before the Trump administration really came into being. So we were going after this with or without the tremendous amounts of rollbacks that are happening federally. So it's part of ensuring that as we go forward, we can continue to have a strong value and ethos here in New York State that we are for clean air, we are for clean water. We'll use every tool on our toolbox to beat back bad policy that might flow from Washington. And let's be honest, we've seen bad policy flow from Washington before this administration. Both Democrats and Republicans have been sued by New York State for failure to uphold clean air and clean water statutes. But I think now more than any time in the nation's history, we understand that this is kind of where states need to be. If we are going to have progress on things like climate change, clean water, and clean air, states are going to have to lead. I would say that the nation kind of desperately needs the Northeast states to lead, particularly New York. I'll get a little territorial. I mean, I think New York has been viewed as a national leader, and I would say that we may have lost, some ground based on our policies in the last couple of years. But I think the nation is sort of pining for states like New York to step up and show the pathway forward, so that when there's a new administration in Washington, there's a lot of good policy that's been incubated by the states. And I think things like having great leadership of other states like Pennsylvania and Montana to have a green amendment on the books, and then New York joining them into this family of strong green amendments is a great next step for New York's leadership in demonstrating where this country truly needs to be.
And so, Denise, I also would just like to add to that. So when we talk about the National Green Amendments for the Generations movement, our litigation was before, and I wrote the book before Donald Trump was elected, right? Just as Peter was talking about in terms of our collective work in New York, right? So, and as Peter rightfully said, right, we've had good and bad policy from, both sides of the political aisle. I mean, if you want to talk about something like fossil fuels, I mean, frankly, when it came to fracking, Obama, Clinton, Bush, were really bad on fracking. It's one of the reasons why it was allowed to proliferate so significantly in the face of federal law, right? So that's really important to acknowledge. Now, when it comes to the environment, when it comes to most things in government, particularly when it comes to the environment, right, the state has a tremendous level of power and authority, and the federal government has a tremendous level of power and authority. State constitutions are a restraint on government action and activity, and the federal constitution is a restraint on federal actions and activities. We need our state constitutions to all have green amendments so that when state government acts legislatively, regulatorily, issuing permits, whatever, approving development projects, that they are constitutionally bound to recognize and protect environmental rights. But that state constitutional protection won't apply to Congress. It won't apply to the president. So what we also need is a federal green amendment. But the truth is, right, if you want to get a federal green amendment, you're going to have to be able to secure a vote of 3/4 of the states in order to amend the federal constitution. So if you're a smart strategist, I like to think that I am, if you're a smart strategist, then and you wanted to get on a path to getting a federal green amendment, you would have to go state by state by state, convincing the people and convincing state government that a federal green amendment was a good idea. What better way to do that than to get state governments to recognize the power and importance of green amendments, so much so that they put them in their own state constitution, right? So our goal at Green Amendments for the Generations is to get green amendments in every single state constitution across our nation, but also ultimately in the federal constitution, because we actually need both, right? A federal green amendment isn't going to check state governors and governments, and a state green amendment isn't going to check the president and the Congress, except like there'll be some overlap, of course, but for the most part, you really need both. And so that's why we're pursuing states first, and then the federal green amendment will be a step two, hopefully in the near term, not. And it's all needed regardless of your political stripes, right? We have good legislators, bad legislators, good presidents, bad presidents, good governors, bad governors, regardless of their political stripes when it comes to the environment. And yet we all need clean water and clean air, stable climate, and healthy environments.
Thank you, Maya. So we have just a few minutes left, and looks like there might be, we'll see if anyone else has a last question they want to ask, but I'll just throw a question in here from our last presentation for Peter. If you could just talk about the Green Amendment and sort of how it will interact with the seeker process and make that a better, how will that work, and will that make the seeker process a better process?
Yeah. So the Green Amendment, obviously, if it's in the Constitution, sort of provides a value statement about clean air and clean water. And when projects are going to be reviewed in New York under the State Environmental Quality Review Act, which is what SEEKR stands for, it'll be part of the review, obviously, is understanding sort of cultural impacts, air pollution impacts, energy impacts. It'll be enter into the discussion, and people can come to, project proposals with this Green Amendment in their back pocket and talk about that value set about permitting facilities going forward and whether government can do that without running the risk of violating the right to clean water and clean air. So it'll give another avenue for community-based organizations to have that dialogue about what we're going to cite and not cite. There's another sort of new law in New York State, which has been described by the New York Times as the most ambitious climate law in the nation. That will also sort of drive this value set discussion. New York has made a bold decision by statute to reduce climate pollution to such an extent that we're going to move entirely away from dirty fuels into an economy, all across the economy, driven by clean fuels. So if we can get a Green Amendment on top of that new statutory requirement that we're going to move off of fossil fuels, and we can also have a broad discussion in the seeker process about all the different things that have to be looked at in terms of permitting, I think that will all lead to that better front-end decision-making. So they all kind of hang together and complement each other in different ways. A bold climate law, long-standing State Environmental Quality Review Act provisions, and hopefully after the voters vote on it in 2021, a new standard in our Constitution that says we have a right to clean air, clean water, and a healthful environment.
Great.
And just to complement that, Kathy, so one thing I want to remind people is that there is a level 2, a session 2 set. This is the session 1 set. We're laying the groundwork, but in session 2, we're going to have more exploration into the legal principles of a Green Amendment, how it would actually affect town council decision making, particularly because we're hoping that one of the things you're going to do is go to your town councils and get resolutions in support. So there's going to be an intentional deeper dive into the seeker question in session 2. And the other thing just to remember, right, is the Constitution's above the laws, right? It is supreme. And so while seeker is a strong law, while the climate law that Peter talked about, while it's strong, while there are a lot of laws in New York that are considered to be very proactive and strong when it comes to the environment, there's also a lot of environmental degradation that continues in the states, and there are many, many times when people believe that state government got it wrong and is resulting in decisions that are infringing on the rights to clean air and clean water. Because the Constitution is above seeker and above it all, we you think government got it wrong and rendered a decision despite the seeker analysis that resulted in violation of the constitutional right, you would be able to use the Constitution to bring a constitutional challenge to the ultimate outcome of that process.
Great, thank you. So we're getting really close to the end now, and we had a one more comment from Patricia, who was just saying, if we're moving away from fossil fuels, why are all of these new gas plants being pushed? And I'll let you, Peter, respond to that in a second. But I thought maybe at the same time, as we're closing down, you could also just reiterate what our process is here in New York. Just review that one more time for everybody, what the next steps are, and then Maya can jump in. And then I think we're at the end of our time.
Yeah, so I'll just answer quickly. And again, I hope you copy down my contact detail so I can, get into a more thorough discussion with you, Patricia. But the short answer is that New York's law just became effective at the beginning of the year, and organizations and citizens are now bringing that provision of New York's law that we have to make decisions that are aligned with the goals of the climate law rather than making it hard to achieve, to Public Service Commission and other regulatory bodies that are weighing whether to make more decisions about allowing more fossil fuel infrastructure to be built out. So there's going to be a lot more on this issue coming forward, and we're going to see a lot less of activity that is about continuing to build out fossil fuel infrastructure in New York. So stay tuned as this law becomes more well-known and implemented by all of state government. You're going to see these poor decisions come to an end, which is really beneficial. The process in New York to pass the Green Amendment, just again, is the public asks the legislature to introduce the amendment, which we have done. We get first passage of the amendment, which has happened, as I mentioned, on Earth Day last year. So we've gotten through the sort of first two steps of the process of presenting an amendment language and getting both the Senate and the Assembly to vote on it. The Constitution then requires another separately elected legislature to then vote again on the bill. So that's why we have to wait until after this fall elections and for the new legislature to be installed in 2021. But we will bring this up not only in the fall, but make sure that the bill is introduced in January and gets an early vote so that we can spend the rest of 2021 educating voters that their rights to clean water and clean air is going to be presented to them on the ballot, and they can vote up and down on this right to clean air and clean water in a healthful environment in 2021. So we're a long ways into the process and still a long ways to go, but I'm really super hopeful that New Yorkers and our legislative leaders will get second passage to the Green Amendment and send it to the voters for the ballot in 2021.
Great, thank you. Any closing thoughts, Maya?
I think Peter covered it beautifully.
Great. Thank you so much. Again, thank you both for excellent presentations, and thank everyone who's been on the webinar and for the excellent questions. It's really been a great evening, and we're looking forward to having you all for the next two sessions. Look for that email, make sure you sign up, and make sure you also follow the link to the petition. So thanks again, and we will see you in the next presentation.
Yes, good night, everybody. Thanks.
Good night.